Wet and wet is when we control the flow of paint into a wet surface. You can see that I'm adding clean water to the surface of the petal, working carefully around the edges to make sure they're smooth and clean. You can go over the surface twice to make sure it's wet enough to add paint to, but make sure it's not running down the paper. Have your paint mix ready. Here, quinacridone magenta and French ultramarine are mixed. The mix has a creamy consistency, and it has to be strong enough to make the darker outline that I need in this petal. And you can see how it spreads into the water, and I can control it with the brush in the areas I want to. The paint will naturally run to the edge of the margin, so be careful not to have too much water involved, otherwise the paint will form a hard ridge around the edge. It's about getting the right balance between water and paint. I can continue to add paint as long as the surface is still wet. I can also control the paint by drying the brush off slightly and fading it out at the base of the petal. As the surface starts to dry, I can start to define certain areas in the petal, giving some of the vein shapes. But care has to be taken doing this because it can cause hard lines. If you don't feel comfortable in adding more, just let it dry, wet again, and add more to a second layer. It's possible to get very sharp edges working with a clean, smooth edge. This is a size 7 pointed brush, and you can see how I can pick out areas on it to give this sharp edge. In the second example, I'm going to do the same thing, but this time working with 2 colours. You can work with multiple colours wet and wet. And it's a very useful technique for laying the foundations for a subject. As before, I wet the surface and drop the paint into the water. The paint runs, and I can control it with my brush to make darker areas or to leave highlights. And this is great for modelling that surface of the petal. If I find an area that I'm working on becomes slightly too dry, I can still add some water to the surface to improve the flow. I can also start to add a second colour. At the base of the petal, I want to add more pink, as there's quite often variation in purple petals. And it's possible to add pinks in, and also maybe yellow at the base, depending on the flower. And you can see it's still wet, and I can still continue to work on it. As with the first petal, I start to add some definition to it, but again, being careful that the petal doesn't become too dry. Once I start to feel that it's too dry, I stop working on it, allow it to dry, and then I can wet the surface again and add more if necessary. Or I can start to work with other techniques, adding detail and dry brush.